Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the fog-choked streets of Georgian London, where medicine met misery and created something far more sinister than either alone. We're exploring the hidden world of laudanum addiction, the respectable vice that destroyed thousands while keeping up appearances. So before you settle in with your perfectly legal substances, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy watching me drag historical figures through their worst decisions. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what your poison of choice is: coffee, tea, or something stronger. Now dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself something warm, and let's descend together into London's chemical underworld. So, you think a little liquid opium for medicinal purposes sounds reasonable, charming, truly, like thinking you can have just one bite of chocolate while stressed. Before you could even dream of floating through Georgian London's fog-choked streets in a poppy-induced haze, you had to make that first fateful acquaintance with the bottle. London's version of liquid salvation. Except the only salvation it offered was temporary escape from a world that seemed determined to crush you beneath the weight of coal smoke, horse dung, and societal expectations. Step 1. Find yourself in need. Real need. Not the fashionable melancholy that poets pretended to suffer from while lounging in coffee houses. We're talking about the kind of need that gnawed at your bones like a starving rat. Maybe it started with a tooth, a molar gone rotten, throbbing with the persistence of a street preacher's sermon, keeping you awake while the rest of Cheapside settled into its nightly symphony of snores, arguments, and the occasional murder. Your local surgeon, if you could call him that, was more butcher than healer, his hands stained permanently brown from God knows what, offering to yank the offending tooth with pliers that looked suspiciously like the ones he used to shoe horses. But first, he'd offer you a swig from his brown bottle. For the pain, he'd say, though the gleam in his eye suggested he knew exactly what he was peddling. Or perhaps it was childbirth. The women of Georgian London knew laudanum as intimately as they knew hunger. Labour pains that could split a woman in half, while some sweating physician muttered Latin phrases that meant absolutely nothing to anyone in the room. The midwife, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, would produce that familiar brown bottle like a magician revealing his best trick. Just a drop, love. Take the edge off. The edge, as it turned out, was the only thing keeping you tethered to reality, but you wouldn't discover that until much later. War wounds, broken bones, consumption, hysteria, nerves, melancholia, the vapors, or simply the crushing realization that you were born into a world where the rich got richer, while you scraped by on turnip soup and false hope. Georgian London had 1,000 ways to break a person, and laudanum had become the standard issue bandage for every single one of them. The first taste was always the same. Sweet, cloying, with an underlying bitterness that made your tongue recoil even as your throat welcomed the warmth. It tasted like liquid velvet mixed with regret, like someone had dissolved a sunset in alcohol and added just enough poison to make things interesting. Within minutes, the world would begin to soften around the edges. That throbbing tooth would fade to a distant memory. The crushing weight of poverty would lift like morning fog. The screaming children next door would sound like a celestial choir. Colors would become more vivid, sounds more musical, and for the first time in months, maybe years, you'd remember what it felt like to breathe without effort. This was medicine, you told yourself, perfectly legal, perfectly respectable. Sold in every apothecary shop from Whitechapel to Westminster. Recommended by physicians who wore powdered wigs and spoke with the authority of men who'd never spent a night wondering where their next meal would come from. Laudanum was as common as gin, but infinitely more refined. Ladies of quality sipped it from crystal bottles. Gentlemen kept it in their waistcoats for medicinal purposes. Even children were dosed with it when they grew too fussy for their governesses to handle. Thomas Sydenham himself, the father of English medicine, had called it God's own medicine. Who were you to argue with such distinguished medical opinion? Besides, it wasn't as if you were drinking gin in some rat-infested tavern or smoking opium in a den full of Chinese sailors and fallen women. This was different. This was civilized. This was medicine. The second time was easier. That troublesome tooth had been pulled, but the socket ached something fierce. The surgeon recommended another dose, just until the healing was complete. You'd earned it, really, having endured such an ordeal. The third time, well, your back was giving you trouble from all that lifting at the docks, or the factory, or wherever it was you sold your body's labor for just enough coin to keep yourself housed and fed. The fourth time, you woke up feeling poorly and decided that a small medicinal dose would set you right for the day's work. By the fifth time, you'd stopped counting. London in the Georgian era was not a city built for comfort. It was a sprawling beast of brick and mortar, coal smoke and ambition, where nearly 1 million souls crowded together in a space that would have been cramped for half that number. The streets were rivers of mud mixed with horse manure, human waste, and the occasional dead cat. The air was thick enough to chew, flavoured with smoke from 10,000 chimneys, and the general aroma of too many people living too close together with insufficient attention to hygiene. You lived, if you could call it living, in a lodging house somewhere between respectability and outright squalor. Maybe it was in Clerkenwell, where the gin shops outnumbered the bakeries 3 to 1. Perhaps in St. Giles, where even the rats looked underfaced and desperate. Could have been in any of the dozen neighbourhoods where working people crammed themselves into rooms barely large enough for one person, let alone the families of 4, 5, 6 that somehow made do with the space. Your room was on the 3rd floor, up a staircase that creaked ominously with every step, threatening to dump you back down to street level if you weren't careful. The walls were thin enough that you could hear Mrs. Pemberton's baby crying at all hours, Mr. Jenkins cursing at his wife with creative vocabulary that would have impressed a dock worker, and the mysterious thumping from the room above that could have been anything from carpentry to murder. The window, when it wasn't fogged with condensation or covered in soot, offered a magnificent view of the brick wall of the building next door. Close enough that you could have reached out and touched it if the window had been designed to open more than the grudging few inches that separated adequate ventilation from adequate security. Below, the alley collected all manner of refused potato peelings, broken crockery, the contents of chamber pots, and the occasional drunk who'd chosen the wrong shortcut home. Your furniture consisted of a bed that had seen better decades, a chair with one leg shorter than the others, and a washstand with a basin that had developed an impressive collection of cracks held together by what you desperately hoped was merely mineral deposits. The mattress was stuffed with what had once been straw, but had long since decomposed into a substance that defied easy classification. It smelled of previous occupants and their various bodily functions, with top notes of mildew and the faint but persistent aroma of something that might have died in the walls. But with laudanum, none of this mattered. The squalor transformed into exotic mystery. The sounds of your neighbours became a symphony of urban life. The smell of decay and desperation became the rich perfume of human existence in all its complexity. The rats in the walls weren't vermin. They were small visitors, fellow travellers on life's journey. Your cramped, dirty room wasn't a prison, it was a cosy refuge from the world's demands. The bottle lived in your coat pocket, wrapped in a piece of cloth to prevent it from clinking against the few coins you managed to scrape together each day. It was a small bottle, brown glass to protect the precious contents from light, with a cork stopper that fit snugly enough to prevent spills, but loosely enough to be removed with trembling fingers. The label, when it was still legible, proclaimed it to be Harrington's elixir for the relief of all manner of pains and nervous complaints. The good doctor's face was printed in black ink, showing a distinguished gentleman with kind eyes and a reassuring moustache. though you sometimes wondered if Dr. Harrington was any more real than the comfort his elixir promised. You'd developed a routine, as all addicts do. Wake up, if you could call it waking, when you'd spent the night floating between consciousness and dreams, so vivid they seemed more real than reality. The first sensation was always emptiness, a hollowing out of everything that made you feel human. Your bones ached, your skin crawled, and your mind raced with 1,000 anxious thoughts that buzzed like flies around rotting meat. This was normal. This was expected. This was why you kept the bottle close. The first dose of the day was medicinal, essential. You couldn't possibly face the demands of employment, of survival, of simply existing in Georgian London, without taking the edge off the world's sharp corners. Just enough to make your hands stop shaking, to quiet the gnawing in your stomach, to transform the crushing weight of another day into something manageable. You'd learn to ration, to measure out precise amounts that would carry you through different parts of the day. A small sip upon waking, just enough to get vertical and moving. Another before work, to make the tedium bearable. A third at midday, when the morning dose had worn thin, and the afternoon stretched endlessly ahead. A fourth after work, to celebrate surviving another day of labour. A fifth before sleep, to ensure that dreams would be pleasant, rather than the nightmarish replays of poverty and desperation that visited the undosed. But Laudanum was a demanding mistress, and what satisfied her yesterday would leave her hungry today. The doses that had once transported you to realms of peace and contentment gradually became the bare minimum required to feel normal. Not good, not euphoric, just normal. The absence of pain rather than the presence of pleasure. Function rather than transcendence. Your work, whatever it was, began to suffer. If you were a clerk, your handwriting grew increasingly unsteady, your mathematical calculations more creative than accurate. If you labored with your hands, your coordination became unreliable, your attention prone to wandering at crucial moments. If you served customers, your manner became either inappropriately dreamy or irritably sharp, depending on how recently you dozed and how much you'd taken. Employers in Georgian London were not known for their patience with workers who couldn't perform their duties reliably. Labour was cheap, replacements easily found. A man who showed up late, worked slowly, made mistakes, or simply seemed off, in some indefinable way wouldn't keep his position long. And finding new employment, while under the influence of laudanum, was like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake. Theoretically possible, but requiring more luck than skill. The social aspects of laudanum addiction were peculiarly Georgian, unlike gin, which marked you immediately as a member of the desperate underclass. Laudanum maintained an aura of respectability. It was medicine, after all, recommended by physicians and used by ladies of quality. The fact that you consumed it in quantities that would have alarmed those same physicians and ladies was a detail best kept private. You developed friendships with others who shared your particular relationship with the bottle. Not friendships exactly, but associations born of mutual recognition. The tremor in someone's hands, the particular pallor of skin, the way their pupils contracted in bright light, the slight slur in speech that came not from alcohol, but from liquid opium. These were the signs that identified your tribe. There was Martha, who'd started on laudanum after a difficult birth and never quite managed to stop. She worked when she could, taking in washing or mending. But her fingers were no longer quite steady enough for the finest work. She'd share what she had when you were short, and you'd do the same for her, though both of you knew that sharing laudanum was like sharing air. Generous in theory, but ultimately inadequate for anyone involved. There was old Tom, who claimed he'd been wounded at Trafalgar, though his stories of naval heroics changed with each telling, and didn't always involve the same battle. His pension, if it existed, went entirely to the bottle, leaving him dependent on the charity of others for food and shelter. But Tom was a gentleman when dosed, full of elaborate stories and courtly manners that suggested he'd fallen from a greater height than most. There was Sarah, barely 20 but aged beyond her years, who'd discovered laudanum when working in a millinery shop where the young ladies of fashion came to purchase bonnets and gossip. She'd been dismissed for theft, taking coins from the till to support her habit, but maintained the refined speech patterns and aspirational mannerisms of someone who'd spent time in better company. You'd meet in the same public house each evening, not because the establishment was particularly welcoming to your kind, but because the proprietor was either too dim or too drunk to notice that his customers weren't actually consuming much alcohol. You'd nurse a single gin or ale for hours while privately dosing from your personal supply, engaging in conversations that meandered through topics with the loose logic of minds not entirely connected to conventional reality. These weren't deep friendships. You couldn't trust someone whose primary loyalty was to a bottle, and they couldn't trust you for the same reason. But there was comfort in shared experience, in being around others who understood why you moved carefully in bright light, why sudden noises made you jump, why you sometimes paused mid-sentence as if listening to voices only you could hear. The economics of laudanum addiction were brutally straightforward. A bottle of decent quality cost somewhere between 2 and 6 shillings, depending on the apothecary and the strength of the preparation. For someone earning perhaps 12 shillings a week, if they were lucky enough to find steady work, this represented a significant portion of their income. But addiction doesn't respect budgets, and as your tolerance increased, so did your expenses. You learned to shop around, to compare prices between different apothecaries, to recognize which preparations were stronger and therefore offered better value for money. You discovered that the fancier establishments in better neighborhoods charged more for essentially the same product, while the shops in poorer areas cut their laudanum with additional alcohol or other substances that reduced the cost but also the effectiveness. Some apothecaries would extend credit to regular customers, though their interest rates would have impressed a moneylender. Others operated on a strictly cash basis, viewing laudanum addicts with the same wariness they showed to gin drinkers and other members of society's unreliable classes. A few enterprising individuals sold homemade preparations of questionable quality and unknown strength, operating from the back rooms of taverns or from market stalls that appeared and disappeared with suspicious regularity. When money was short, which was most of the time, you learned to make substitutions and economies. Weaker preparations that required larger doses but cost less overall. Sharing bottles with friends when individual purchase was impossible. Diluting your supply with additional alcohol to make it last longer, even though this reduced the effectiveness and increased the unpleasant side effects. You became an expert at identifying the signs of withdrawal and calculating exactly how much you needed to stave off the worst symptoms, while preserving enough for later. This was a delicate balance, like a tightrope walker performing over an abyss. Too little, and you'd spend the day in misery, unable to work or function. Too much, and you'd be useless in a different way, too euphoric and disconnected to manage the basic requirements of survival. The physical effects of regular laudanum use were impossible to ignore, though you became remarkably skilled at explaining them away. The constant constipation you attributed to poor diet. The pallor and weight loss were simply the natural result of hard work and insufficient food. The tremor in your hands was caused by cold weather or nervousness. The way your pupils contracted to tiny points in daylight was dismissed as a personal peculiarity. But your body kept a more honest accounting. Your digestive system, slowed by regular doses of opium, made every meal an ordeal, and every bowel movement a significant event worthy of celebration. You learned to eat carefully, avoiding foods that might further complicate your already compromised digestion. Bread, thin soups, weak tea, and little else. Rich foods, meat, anything with fiber or substance would sit in your stomach like rocks, making you feel sick for hours. Your sleep patterns became erratic and unpredictable. Laudanum promised rest, but it delivered a peculiar kind of unconsciousness that wasn't quite sleep and wasn't quite waking. You drift in and out of awareness, sometimes for hours, experiencing vivid dreams that felt more real than your actual life. Colors were more intense in these dreams, emotions more profound, experiences more meaningful than anything the waking world offered. But these dream states were fragile, easily disrupted by noise, discomfort, or the simple fact that the laudanum was wearing off. You'd wake feeling as if you hadn't slept at all, despite having spent 12 or 14 hours in bed. Your body ached, your mind felt foggy, and the prospect of another day seemed overwhelming until you reached for that familiar brown bottle. The social isolation deepened gradually, so slowly that you barely noticed until it was complete. Friends who didn't share your particular relationship with medicine found your company increasingly unreliable. You'd make plans to meet, then forget entirely, lost in a laudanum haze that made hours disappear like smoke. Or you'd show up, but be so obviously under the influence that conversation became awkward and stilted. Family members, if you had any left in London, learn to recognize the signs. Your mother might still invite you to Sunday dinner, but she'd count the silver before you left. Your siblings would greet you with the wary politeness reserved for dangerous animals and unpredictable relatives. Children, with their brutal honesty, would stare at your trembling hands and ask loudly why your eyes looked so funny. Romantic relationships were particularly challenging. Laudanum affected every aspect of physical intimacy, making what should have been pleasurable either impossible or uninteresting. Emotional connections became strained when your primary relationship was with a bottle rather than with other human beings. The elaborate lies necessary to maintain your supply created distance between you and anyone who might otherwise care about your well-being. You learned to live multiple lives simultaneously. There was the public self, the one who appeared at work and interacted with landlords and shopkeepers, who maintained the pretense of respectability and reliability. This version of yourself was carefully managed, appearing only when absolutely necessary, and only when sufficiently dosed to function, but not so heavily medicated as to arouse suspicion. Then there was the private self, the one who lived in that cramped room with the rats and the smell of decay, who spent hours in a dreamlike state where reality became negotiable, and time moved according to the rhythm of doses rather than the movement of clock hands. This self was more honest, but also more vulnerable, subject to emotions and sensations that the public self couldn't afford to acknowledge. The money always ran out before the month did. Rent was due every week, food had to be purchased daily, and the bottle demanded constant feeding. You learned to prioritize with ruthless efficiency. Laudanum first, always first, because without it you couldn't function well enough to earn money or manage the basic requirements of staying alive. Then shelter, because sleeping rough in London's climate was a death sentence for someone in your weakened condition. Food came third, if at all. You discovered muscles you didn't know you had when they began to cramp and spasm during periods of insufficient dosing. Your legs would twitch and jump involuntarily, making sleep impossible, even when exhaustion made standing difficult. Your back would seize up in knots of pain that felt like someone was tightening piano wire beneath your skin. Your stomach would clench and release in waves of nausea that left you retching even when there was nothing to bring up. The mental effects were perhaps worse than the physical ones. Without adequate laudanum, your thoughts would race in circles, returning obsessively to the same worries and fears without resolution. Every problem seemed insurmountable. Every minor setback felt like a catastrophe. Every social interaction became fraught with imagined dangers and hidden meanings. The world was too bright, too loud, too sharp, too demanding. But these periods of withdrawal also brought moments of clarity that were almost worse than the confusion. You'd suddenly see your situation with perfect, terrible accuracy alone in a dirty room, dependent on a substance that was slowly killing you, cut off from meaningful relationships, barely surviving financially, with no prospects for improvement and every reason to expect things to get worse. These moments of insight were unbearable, which made reaching for the bottle not just desirable, but essential for psychological survival. You couldn't live with that level of clarity about your circumstances. The laudanum wasn't just treating pain. It was making existence tolerable by blurring the sharp edges of reality until they couldn't cut quite so deeply. The apothecary shops of Georgian London became your churches, their proprietors your priests. You knew the opening hours of every establishment within walking distance of your lodgings, and several that required longer journeys but offered better prices or stronger preparations. You could identify the sound of their bells from blocks away, distinguish their particular aromas from the general miasma of London's streets. Mr. Whitmore's shop on Drury Lane carried the most reliable preparation, though he'd begun to eye you with suspicion as your purchases increased in frequency and quantity. His assistant, a nervous young man with ink-stained fingers, would sometimes refuse to serve you if you appeared too obviously under the influence, claiming that shop policy prohibited sales to intoxicated customers. Mrs. Patterson's establishment in Seven Dials was less scrupulous, but also less reliable. Her laudanum was cheaper but inconsistent in strength, sometimes barely effective and occasionally so potent that a normal dose would leave you unconscious for hours. She operated from the front room of her lodging house, with bottles stored in a cabinet that looked suspiciously like it had been liberated from someone else's premises. There was a travelling apothecary who set up his stall in different locations around the city, following some schedule known only to himself and his regular customers. His preparation was strong and reasonably priced, but finding him required knowledge of his movements that had to be purchased through tips and bribes to other addicts who'd managed to track his patterns. The quality of laudanum varied dramatically depending on its source. The best preparations, sold by respectable apothecaries to wealthy customers, contained precise amounts of opium dissolved in alcohol, sometimes with additional ingredients like saffron or cinnamon to improve the taste and justify the higher price. These were smooth, predictable, and effective in small doses. The cheaper preparations were often adulterated with additional alcohol to increase volume, or cut with other substances that might produce some of the desired effects at reduced cost. You learn to recognize the signs of inferior product: harshness on the tongue, unpredictable potency, unpleasant side effects like excessive nausea or headaches that seemed worse than the original complaints the laudanum was meant to address. Some unscrupulous dealers sold preparations that were barely laudanum at all, consisting mostly of alcohol colored with burnt sugar and flavored with bitter herbs to approximate the expected taste. These were worse than useless, providing none of the relief you desperately needed, while still costing money you couldn't afford to waste. You became an expert at testing new supplies, taking smaller initial doses to assess potency before committing to your usual amount. This was a delicate calculation, balancing the need for caution against the urgency of withdrawal symptoms that demanded immediate relief. Too cautious, and you'd suffer unnecessarily while determining the proper dose. Too bold, and you might find yourself dangerously overdosed on a preparation stronger than expected. The social geography of laudanum use mapped closely onto London's existing class divisions, but with some interesting variations. Wealthy women used it for nervous complaints and feminine ailments, consuming it in the privacy of their boudoirs from crystal bottles supplied by the most expensive apothecaries. Middle-class patients took it for legitimate medical conditions, under proper supervision, carefully following their physician's instructions and maintaining detailed records of their dosages. Working-class addicts like yourself occupied a different territory entirely. You weren't patients, you were customers. You weren't receiving treatment, you were making purchases. The pretense of medical necessity wore thin quickly when you couldn't afford proper medical care, and when your consumption patterns clearly exceeded any reasonable therapeutic dose. This distinction mattered because it affected how others treated you and how you were allowed to treat yourself. A lady's laudanum habit was a delicate medical matter requiring understanding and discretion. A working man's laudanum addiction was a moral failing that deserved censure and suspicion. The legal status of laudanum in Georgian London was refreshingly straightforward. It was completely legal and largely unregulated. Anyone with money could purchase it from any apothecary without prescription or explanation. This accessibility was both blessing and curse, removing barriers to obtaining relief while also removing safeguards that might have prevented or limited addiction. But legal didn't mean socially acceptable, at least not in the quantities and circumstances of serious addiction. There was a vast difference between the respectable use of laudanum for medical purposes and the obvious dependency that marked you as a different class of person entirely. Shopkeepers might serve you, but they'd count their change carefully and watch to make sure you didn't pocket anything while making your purchase. Landlords learned to recognize the signs and adjust their policies accordingly. Higher deposits, weekly rather than monthly rent collection, more frequent room inspections to check for damage or unauthorized occupants. They knew that laudanum addicts were unreliable tenants, likely to fall behind on payments, prone to accidents caused by impaired coordination, and attractive to other undesirable types who shared their particular interests. Employers, when you could find them, developed strategies for managing workers whose reliability was compromised by their medication. Simpler tasks, closer supervision, immediate dismissal for obvious intoxication during working hours. Some would make allowances for a valued employee's medical needs, but most found it easier to hire someone without such complications. The criminal justice system of Georgian London had little patience for excuses based on medical necessity. Theft was theft, regardless of whether the stolen money was intended for food or for laudanum. Disorderly conduct was prosecutable, whether you were drunk on gin or floating on opium. The courts might show some leniency for first offences by otherwise respectable defendants, but repeat appearances by known addicts received harsher treatment. You learn to navigate these social and legal realities with the skills of a practiced diplomat. When and where to appear in public. How to modulate your behavior to avoid unwanted attention. Which establishments would serve you and which would refuse. How to time your doses to maximize function during crucial interactions while maintaining adequate relief from withdrawal symptoms. The daily routine became a carefully choreographed dance between competing demands. Wake up sick and shaking, dose enough to function, attempt to work or otherwise earn money, dose again to maintain stability, navigate social interactions and business transactions, dose to prepare for sleep, repeat endlessly with minor variations based on available supply and financial resources. Each day required constant calculation and recalculation. How much did you have? How much could you need? How much could you afford? When was the last dose? When would you need the next one? Where could you obtain more when the current supply ran out? These questions occupied most of your mental energy, leaving little attention available for other concerns. The people around you began to blur into categories based on their usefulness to your primary goal of maintaining adequate supply. Employers were sources of money that could be converted to laudanum. Landlords were obstacles to be managed with just enough payment to maintain shelter. Other addicts were potential allies or competitors for limited resources. Everyone else was largely irrelevant unless they could somehow contribute to or threaten your ability to remain adequately dosed. This utilitarian view of relationships was both necessary for survival and destructive to your humanity. You couldn't afford to care too deeply about people who couldn't help you maintain your habit, but you also couldn't form genuine connections with people you viewed primarily as resources. The result was a profound isolation that the laudanum could temporarily mask, but never truly resolved. Your body continued to adapt to the regular presence of opium in ways that made stopping seem impossible, even when you wanted to quit. The physical withdrawal symptoms were severe enough to be dangerous, potentially including seizures, delirium, and cardiovascular collapse. But the psychological withdrawal was perhaps worse: the crushing depression, the inability to experience pleasure from normal activities, the overwhelming anxiety that made every minor problem seem catastrophic. You tried to stop several times, usually when financial circumstances made continuing impossible, rather than from any genuine desire to quit. These attempts rarely lasted more than a few days before the combined physical and mental misery drove you back to the bottle with renewed desperation. Each failed attempt confirmed your suspicion that you were too weak, too flawed, too dependent to ever live without chemical assistance. The shame of these failures added another layer to your burden. You were not only addicted to laudanum, you were someone who couldn't even quit laudanum. This failure of willpower seemed to confirm every negative judgment about your character and moral fiber. If you couldn't overcome a simple dependency on medicine, what did that say about your worth as a person? But shame was a luxury you couldn't afford for long. It required mental energy better spent on the practical problems of survival and supply maintenance. Self, reproach, and moral inventory were activities for people who had the stability and security to engage in psychological self-improvement. Your circumstances demanded a more pragmatic approach, focused on immediate needs rather than long-term character development. The seasons affected your addiction in ways you hadn't anticipated. Winter was particularly challenging because the cold made withdrawal symptoms worse, while also making it more difficult to earn money and more expensive to maintain basic shelter and warmth. Your metabolism changed with regular laudanum use, making you more sensitive to temperature variations and less able to regulate your body heat naturally. Summer brought different problems. The heat made your already compromised digestion worse, while the longer days disrupted sleep patterns that were already irregular. Sweating became more profuse, leading to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances that complicated the other physical effects of your habit. The smell of your inadequate personal hygiene became more noticeable, adding to the social isolation. Spring and autumn were transitional periods that sometimes offered hope of change or improvement, though these hopeful feelings were usually temporary and often chemically induced, rather than based on genuine improvements in your circumstances. The changing seasons reminded you that time was passing, that you were getting older without making progress toward any meaningful goals. Your relationship with food evolved as your addiction progressed. Laudanum suppressed appetite while also slowing digestion, creating a complicated relationship with eating that went beyond simple hunger and satiation. Food became medicinal, carefully chosen to complement rather than interfere with your primary medication. Bland, easily digested items that wouldn't upset your already compromised stomach. You learned to eat strategically, timing meals to minimize conflict with dosing schedules while ensuring adequate nutrition to maintain basic health. Too much food too close to a dose could interfere with absorption and reduce effectiveness. Too little food over time would weaken your already compromised system and make withdrawal symptoms worse when supply was interrupted. The act of eating became mechanical rather than pleasurable. Food was fuel, nothing more. Consumed because your body required it rather than because you enjoyed the taste or social aspects of dining. Restaurants and taverns were places to hide while dosing rather than venues for social interaction or culinary pleasure. Cooking was largely beyond your capabilities, requiring planning, coordination, and sustained attention that were difficult to maintain with your altered mental state. You survived on purchased items that required minimal preparation. Bread, cheese, prepared pies, whatever was available from street vendors, and required no more effort than chewing and swallowing. Your personal hygiene deteriorated in ways that were both cause and effect of social isolation. bathing required planning, energy, and resources that were always in short supply. Your clothing, unchanged for days or weeks at a time, absorbed the smells of your lodgings, your body, and the various streets and establishments you frequented while pursuing your supply. The mirror in your room, when you could bear to look at it, showed changes that were impossible to ignore or explain away. Your face had taken on the particular pallor of chronic laudanum use, a waxy complexion that suggested illness, even when you felt relatively well. Your eyes were frequently bloodshot, with pupils that contracted to pinpoints in normal light. Your hands trembled almost constantly, making fine motor tasks difficult and drawing unwanted attention to your condition. Your teeth, already compromised by poor diet and limited dental care, began to deteriorate more rapidly under the influence of regular laudanum use. The sweet, sticky preparation seemed to promote decay, while the reduced saliva production and impaired oral hygiene habits accelerated the destruction. Toothaches, which had originally led many people to laudanum, became more frequent and severe, creating a vicious cycle of pain and medication. But these physical changes were gradual and easy to rationalize. Everyone in your social class looked somewhat poorly. The effects of poverty, poor nutrition, and hard labor were visible on every face in your neighborhood. Your deterioration wasn't dramatically different from the general decline that marked the lives of London's working poor. The financial mathematics of addiction became increasingly complex as your tolerance continued to increase. What had started as a manageable expense requiring some budget adjustments had evolved into a financial monster that devoured every penny you could earn, steal, or borrow. You developed sophisticated accounting systems to track intake, expense, and projected needs that would have impressed a banker if applied to legitimate business purposes. Credit arrangements with various suppliers required careful management to prevent any single creditor from becoming too impatient while maintaining access to essential supplies. You learned to spread your debt across multiple sources, to negotiate payment schedules, to offer collateral or services in exchange for extended terms. These skills were transferable to other aspects of survival, but came at the cost of constant anxiety about discovery and collection. Side jobs and temporary employment became necessary to supplement whatever regular income you could maintain. These were typically activities that could be performed while under the influence of laudanum, simple manual labor, errands, cleaning, anything that didn't require sustained attention or complex decision-making. The pay was poor, but it helped bridge the gap between your regular income and your pharmaceutical expenses. Petty theft became an option that you considered more frequently than you cared to admit. Small items that could be easily concealed and quickly converted to cash, taken from employers, landlords, or other addicts who might be too impaired to notice immediately. The moral implications of these thefts were troubling, but the immediate need for money to prevent withdrawal symptoms made ethical considerations seem like luxuries you couldn't afford. The social connections formed around shared addiction were utilitarian, but also provided a sense of community that was absent from other aspects of your life. Fellow addicts understood your priorities, your constraints, your motivations in ways that straight society never could. There was no need to explain why you might need to borrow money, why you looked unwell, why your behavior was sometimes erratic. But these relationships were also fundamentally unreliable. People whose primary loyalty was to a bottle couldn't be trusted with important matters. Money lent would disappear into someone else's supply. Promises made would be broken when withdrawal symptoms became severe enough to override social obligations. Friendships would dissolve when resources became too scarce to share. The laudanum community had its own informal economy based on barter, credit, and mutual assistance. Information about new suppliers, warnings about inferior product, tips about employment opportunities, shared resources during periods of particular hardship. This underground network operated parallel to the legitimate economy. serving people who were increasingly excluded from normal commercial relationships. Violence was rare, but not unknown. Desperate people would sometimes resort to robbery or assault to obtain money for their supply, particularly during periods of widespread scarcity, when prices increased or quality decreased. The victims were usually other addicts, chosen because they were unlikely to report crimes to authorities and because their weakened condition made them easier targets. But most interactions within the Laudanum community were characterized by a wary mutual tolerance rather than active hostility. Everyone understood that everyone else was struggling with the same fundamental problem. Judgment was pointless when you were all trapped in the same circumstances. Cooperation, when possible, offered better prospects than competition for resources that were already inadequate. The children in your neighborhood learned to recognize the signs of laudanum addiction before they could properly read or write. They'd watch the adults stumble through their daily routines with the clinical detachment of natural scientists observing interesting specimens. Some children became useful intermediaries, running errands for adults, too impaired to manage their own business affairs, accepting small payments for services that required mobility and basic competence. These children developed a sophisticated understanding of adult weakness that was both impressive and disturbing. They knew which grown-ups could be trusted with small responsibilities, and which were too far gone to be reliable. They learned to navigate around the adult world's pharmaceutical priorities, adjusting their expectations and behavior accordingly. Some of these children would eventually follow their parents and neighbors into the same pattern of dependency, having learned early that chemical solutions to life's problems were not only acceptable, but normal. Others would develop a permanent aversion to anything stronger than weak beer, having seen too clearly where laudanum led those who embraced it too enthusiastically. Your dreams, when laudanum permitted actual sleep rather than the semi-conscious floating that passed for rest, became more vivid and meaningful than your waking experiences. In these dreams, you were healthy, successful, loved, respected. You had clean clothes, adequate food, secure shelter, meaningful work, genuine relationships. The contrast between dream life and waking reality became so stark that consciousness felt like punishment. Sometimes you'd wake from these dreams convinced that your current circumstances were the nightmare, that your real life was the one where everything made sense and worked out well. The transition from sleep to waking became a daily tragedy, a repeated loss of everything good and hopeful in exchange for the harsh realities of addiction, poverty, and social isolation. But even the dreams were unreliable, subject to the chemical changes in your brain caused by fluctuating levels of opium. Sometimes they were beautiful beyond description. Other times they were terrifying journeys through landscapes of anxiety and paranoia that left you more exhausted upon waking than you'd been before sleep. The laudanum itself became a character in these dreams, sometimes appearing as a benevolent figure offering comfort and relief, other times as a demanding master whose needs superseded all other considerations. You'd dream of finding unlimited supplies, of bottles that never emptied, of apothecaries who gave their goods away freely. You'd also dream of being unable to find any laudanum at all, of searching desperately through empty shops and hostile neighborhoods, while withdrawal symptoms intensified beyond bearing. Your memory began to function differently under the influence of chronic laudanum use. Recent events became fuzzy and unreliable, while distant memories from childhood or young adulthood seemed more vivid and present than current experiences. You might forget conversations that had happened earlier the same day, while remembering with perfect clarity the smell of bread baking in your mother's kitchen 20 years earlier. This shift in mental function made it increasingly difficult to manage the practical aspects of life that required attention to recent information and current circumstances. You'd forget appointments, commitments, instructions, deadlines. You'd lose track of money owed and payments due. You'd repeat conversations, because you couldn't remember having them before. But the enhanced recall of distant memories wasn't entirely pleasant. Traumatic experiences from your past became more accessible and emotionally present, often intrusion into current awareness without warning. The laudanum that was supposed to provide relief from pain sometimes amplified emotional pain by removing the natural protective barriers that normally kept difficult memories at a manageable distance. The physical deterioration accelerated as your addiction progressed beyond the early stages of manageable dependency. Your weight dropped to alarming levels as your appetite diminished, and your ability to keep food down became increasingly unreliable. Your skin took on an unhealthy appearance that couldn't be attributed entirely to poor hygiene or inadequate nutrition. Muscle mass decreased as physical activity became more difficult and less appealing. The coordination required for manual labor became unreliable, making it harder to find and keep employment that might have provided the money needed to maintain your supply. This created another vicious cycle where the very substance you needed to function made it harder to earn the money required to obtain that substance. Your immune system, compromised by poor nutrition, stress, and the direct effects of chronic opium use, made you more susceptible to the various diseases that circulated freely through London's crowded, unsanitary neighborhoods. Simple colds became major illnesses. Minor injuries took longer to heal and were more likely to become infected. You were constantly fighting off some ailment or recovering from some complaint that would have been insignificant for a healthier person. But illness also provided a socially acceptable excuse for laudanum use. A persistent cough, digestive problems, or general malaise could justify medicinal doses that might otherwise be viewed with suspicion. You learned to present your symptoms in ways that encouraged medical rather than moral interpretations of your laudanum consumption. The seasonal cycles of disease in Georgian London became personally significant in ways they'd never been before your addiction. Cholera outbreaks, influenza epidemics, typhoid fever consumption, and all the other ailments that regularly swept through the city's population posed particular dangers for someone in your weakened condition. But they also provided opportunities for increased laudanum access as demand for pain relief and symptom management increased. Medical care, such as it was, became both more necessary and less accessible as your addiction progressed. Physicians, even those who were sympathetic to patients suffering from obvious dependency, were expensive luxuries that your finances couldn't support. The medical charity cases available to the deserving poor weren't generally available to people whose problems were perceived as self-inflicted moral failings. Folk remedies and home treatments became more important as professional medical care became less available. Other addicts shared knowledge about managing withdrawal symptoms, treating common ailments, and maintaining basic health while living in circumstances that were actively destructive to physical well-being. This informal medical network provided care that was often more practical and accessible than official medicine. But the quality of advice available through these channels was inconsistent and sometimes dangerous. People who were themselves impaired by laudanum use weren't always the most reliable sources of medical information. Treatments that had worked for one person might be inappropriate or harmful for another. The lack of medical training among your advisors meant that serious conditions might be misdiagnosed or ignored until they became life-threatening. Your relationship with time became fundamentally altered by chronic laudanum use. Hours could pass without your awareness, disappearing into a haze of semi-consciousness that felt pleasant while it lasted, but left you disoriented and behind schedule when you returned to fuller awareness. Appointments were missed, deadlines ignored, commitments forgotten simply because time had become unreliable and unpredictable. The normal rhythms of daily life, meals, work, sleep, social interaction, became subordinated to the rhythm of dosing. Your schedule was determined by when you'd last taken laudanum, when you'd need to take it next, and when you could obtain more if your supply was running low. Everything else had to be arranged around these pharmaceutical necessities. This disruption of normal time patterns contributed to social isolation, as you became increasingly unable to participate reliably in activities that required punctuality or sustained attention. Friends and family learned not to depend on you for important matters. Employers found your schedule incompatible with their operational needs. Even casual social interactions became difficult when you couldn't predict your own availability or condition from one day to the next. The legal consequences of your addiction, while not directly related to laudanum use itself, accumulated through the various illegal activities that became necessary to maintain your supply: theft, fraud, vagrancy, disturbing the peace, failure to pay debts. These were the charges that brought laudanum addicts into contact with Georgian London's justice system. The courts showed little sympathy for defendants whose crimes were motivated by addiction. The prevailing view was that dependency on any substance, even a legal medicine like laudanum, represented a moral failing that aggravated rather than mitigated criminal behavior. Judges were more likely to impose harsh sentences on repeat offenders whose problems were clearly related to their pharmaceutical habits. Imprisonment was particularly dangerous for someone dependent on laudanum. The withdrawal symptoms experienced while confined could be severe enough to cause serious medical complications. But prison officials were neither equipped nor inclined to provide medical management of addiction. Many addicts died in custody from complications related to sudden cessation of their accustomed doses. The criminal justice system's approach to addiction-related crime was entirely punitive, with no recognition that addressing the underlying dependency might be more effective at preventing future offenses than punishment alone. Treatment options didn't exist in any meaningful sense, leaving addicts caught in repetitive cycles of crime: arrest, punishment, release, and return to the same circumstances that had led to criminal behavior in the first place. Your family relationships, if any survived the progression of your addiction, became characterized by a mixture of love, frustration, anger, and resignation. Relatives who still cared about your welfare found themselves caught between desire to help and recognition that their assistance often enabled continued self-destruction rather than promoting recovery. Parents, siblings, spouses, and children learned to protect themselves emotionally and financially from the chaos that surrounded your addiction. They'd set boundaries, make ultimatums, cut off contact, then relent and try again when guilt or hope overcame their better judgment. These cycles of reconciliation and estrangement were painful for everyone involved and rarely resulted in lasting positive change. The extended family networks that provided crucial support for most members of the working class gradually excluded addicts whose behavior had become too unpredictable and disruptive. Family gatherings became uncomfortable when you attended and sad when you didn't. Your relatives learned to make plans that didn't depend on your participation, while hoping that someday you'd be able to rejoin the family in meaningful ways. Children in families affected by laudanum addiction developed coping strategies that were both impressive and heartbreaking. They learned to be self-reliant at younger ages than should have been necessary to make responsible decisions when the adults around them couldn't, to hide family problems from outsiders who might not understand or might make the situation worse through well-intentioned interference. But these children also paid emotional and developmental costs for their early maturity and excessive responsibility. They missed opportunities for normal childhood experiences while managing adult concerns. They learned not to depend too heavily on the addicted adult's promises or presence, developing a protective cynicism that served them well in the short term, but might limit their ability to form trusting relationships later in life. The religious institutions of Georgian London offered various responses to the problems posed by laudanum addiction, ranging from compassionate assistance to moral condemnation. Some clergy viewed addiction as a medical condition deserving of sympathy and support, while others saw it as evidence of spiritual weakness that required repentance and reformation. Church-based charity programs sometimes provided food, clothing, and temporary shelter to addicts who demonstrated genuine desire for reform. But these programs typically required abstinence as a condition of assistance. For someone physically dependent on laudanum, this requirement was often impossible to meet without medical supervision that wasn't available through religious channels. The moral framework provided by religious teaching could be either helpful or harmful for addicts seeking to understand and address their dependency. Some found comfort and motivation in spiritual approaches that emphasized redemption and the possibility of transformation. Others were crushed by religious teachings that portrayed their addiction as evidence of moral failure, deserving divine punishment. Religious communities could provide social support and structure for addicts attempting recovery, but they could also impose additional shame and isolation on those who were unable to achieve the levels of spiritual and behavioral improvement expected by their congregations. The gap between religious ideals and the practical realities of addiction created additional stress for people already struggling with overwhelming challenges. The economic impact of widespread laudanum addiction on Georgian London was significant, but largely unrecognized by contemporary observers. Thousands of workers whose productivity was impaired by their pharmaceutical habits represented a substantial loss of economic output, while the money spent on laudanum represented resources diverted from other forms of consumption that might have stimulated legitimate economic activity. The underground economy that developed around addiction, the informal networks of credit, barter, and mutual assistance, operated parallel to the official economy but remained largely invisible to authorities and statisticians. This shadow economy involved substantial sums of money and complex relationships that affected thousands of people but left no official records. Entire neighborhoods developed reputations based on their associations with laudanum addiction. Areas where addicts congregated became less desirable for other residents and businesses, leading to declining property values and reduced investment in local infrastructure. The concentration of addiction in certain geographic areas created feedback loops that made these neighborhoods increasingly isolated from the mainstream economy. The social costs of addiction extended beyond the individual addicts and their immediate families to affect entire communities. Children growing up in neighborhoods with high rates of addiction were more likely to develop dependencies themselves, creating intergenerational patterns that perpetuated the problem across decades. Your daily existence had been reduced to its most essential elements: obtaining laudanum, consuming laudanum, and surviving the intervals between doses. Everything else, work, relationships, personal hygiene, nutrition, shelter maintenance, financial planning, became secondary concerns to be managed only insofar as they supported your primary pharmaceutical needs. This simplification of life's priorities was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it eliminated the need to make complex decisions about competing goals and values. Terrifying because it revealed how completely your autonomy had been surrendered to a chemical substance that cared nothing for your welfare, ambitions, or survival. The bottle had become your master, your god, your closest relationship, your primary concern, your reason for waking up each morning, and your last thought before sleep. It demanded constant attention, consumed every resource you could gather, and offered in return only temporary relief from the suffering it caused by its absence. Yet you couldn't imagine life without it. The periods of withdrawal you'd experienced had shown you what existence would be like without laudanum's protective barrier between yourself and reality's sharp edges. That existence seemed impossible to endure, a constant state of physical and emotional agony that made death seem preferable to consciousness. The other addicts you knew had tried various strategies for managing their dependencies: gradual reduction of doses, complete abstinence, substitution of other substances, geographic relocation to escape familiar suppliers and triggers. Most of these attempts failed within days or weeks, confirming your belief that successful recovery was either impossible or required resources and support that weren't available to people in your circumstances. The few success stories you'd heard about were typically associated with dramatic changes in life circumstances that weren't replicable for most addicts. Inheritance of money that allowed complete withdrawal from the social and economic pressures that made addiction appealing. Marriage to someone wealthy enough to provide both motivation and resources for recovery. Religious conversion experiences that provided supernatural assistance with withdrawal symptoms. But these exceptions only emphasized the general rule that most laudanum addicts would continue their dependencies until death ended both their suffering and their need for relief. This recognition brought a certain peace, eliminating the additional suffering caused by false hope and impossible expectations. Your story was not unique in Georgian London. Thousands of people were living similar lives, managing similar dependencies, facing similar challenges with varying degrees of success and failure. You were part of a hidden population whose existence was acknowledged, but not addressed by the authorities and institutions that shaped public policy. The laudanum epidemic, if it could be called that, was largely invisible because its victims were primarily members of the working class whose suffering didn't directly affect the comfortable classes who wrote laws and shaped social policy. Unlike gin, which produced dramatic public displays of drunkenness and disorder, laudanum use was typically private and quiet, making it easy to ignore until individual cases became extreme enough to require official attention. The medical establishment's complicity in creating and maintaining this epidemic through liberal prescribing and promotion of laudanum as a universal remedy was not generally acknowledged. Physicians who profited from selling laudanum-based preparations had little incentive to question the long-term effects of their treatments or to develop alternatives that might be less profitable but more conducive to patient welfare. The economic interests involved in laudanum production and distribution, apothecaries, importers, physicians, and the various suppliers of raw materials formed an informal industry that benefited from maintaining high levels of consumption among the population. These interests were not formally coordinated, but they shared a common stake in promoting laudanum use and resisting any social or legal developments that might reduce demand. Your individual addiction was thus part of a larger social and economic system that created and sustained dependency among thousands of people, while generating profits for dozens of businesses and hundreds of individuals who had little direct contact with the human costs of their commercial activities. The isolation imposed by addiction was so complete that you rarely considered these larger patterns or connections. Your focus was necessarily narrow, concentrated on the immediate challenges of daily survival and supply maintenance. The broader social implications of your condition were luxuries of perspective that you couldn't afford to contemplate. But occasionally, in moments of clarity that came during periods of adequate dosing, when your immediate needs were satisfied, you'd recognize the absurdity and tragedy of your situation. You were consuming a substance that was slowly destroying your health in order to feel well enough to work at jobs that barely paid enough to purchase more of that same substance, while living in conditions that made the need for chemical escape seem entirely reasonable. These moments of insight were brief and painful, quickly submerged beneath the more immediate concerns of dosing schedules and supply management. Self-awareness was another luxury that you couldn't maintain for long without risking the psychological stability required to manage your daily routine. The future, as a concept requiring planning and hope, had largely disappeared from your mental landscape. Tomorrow was significant only insofar as it represented another day that would require adequate laudanum supplies. Next week mattered only if your rent was due. Next month was too distant to warrant consideration, unless it involved some scheduled event that might affect your access to medication. Long-term goals, career advancement, relationship development, personal growth, financial security. These were concerns for people whose lives weren't organized around the rhythm of pharmaceutical necessity. Your energy was fully consumed by short-term survival, leaving nothing available for longer-term planning or development. This foreshortening of temporal perspective was both a symptom of your addiction and a necessary adaptation to circumstances that made long-term planning unrealistic. People whose immediate survival was constantly threatened by supply interruptions, financial crises, health problems, and social instability couldn't afford to invest much mental energy in distant future possibilities. But the absence of future orientation also made recovery more difficult by eliminating the hope and motivation that might have provided incentives for enduring the short-term suffering required to break free from dependency, without a vision of a better future worth working toward. The immediate relief offered by continued laudanum use would always seem more attractive than the uncertain benefits of attempting to quit. Your body had become a stranger to you, responding to external stimuli and internal needs according to patterns that seemed disconnected from your conscious control. Hunger, thirst, pain, pleasure, fatigue, alertness. All of these sensations were filtered through the chemical effects of laudanum in ways that made them unreliable guides to your actual physical condition. You might feel hungry when your body was actually adequately nourished, or experience no appetite when you desperately needed food. Pain signals that should have warned you about injury or illness were muted or eliminated entirely, while withdrawal symptoms created sensations of illness when your body was actually healthy except for its dependency on external chemical support. This disconnection from normal physical feedback made it difficult to maintain basic health and safety. You'd discover injuries you didn't remember receiving, ignore symptoms of illnesses that required attention, fail to recognize signs of exhaustion or malnutrition until they became severe enough to interfere with your ability to obtain and consume laudanum. The boundary between your identity and your addiction had become so blurred that you could no longer imagine who you might be without the constant influence of opium. Your personality, your reactions to stress, your emotional responses, your social behaviors, all of these had been shaped by years of chemical influence to the point where your natural characteristics were largely forgotten. This loss of authentic self was perhaps the most profound tragedy of addiction, more significant than the financial costs, social isolation, or physical deterioration. You had become a ghost of your former person, animated by chemical necessity rather than genuine human motivation. Going through the motions of life without experiencing most of its actual content. Yet this ghost existence had its own internal logic and consistency. You had adapted to circumstances that would have been unimaginable to your younger, healthier self, developing skills and strategies that demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness and resilience. The daily management of addiction required intelligence, planning, and determination that could have been applied to more constructive purposes under different circumstances. The fact that you continued to survive, to find ways to obtain necessary supplies, to maintain minimal shelter and nutrition, to navigate complex social and economic challenges while impaired by chronic intoxication. These accomplishments deserved recognition, even if they served ultimately self-destructive purposes. Your story would end, eventually, though probably not in any dramatic fashion. Most laudanum addicts didn't die in theatrical overdoses or spectacular collapses. They simply faded away gradually, worn down by the accumulated effects of malnutrition, disease, exposure, and the various complications that resulted from living in poverty while dependent on an expensive pharmaceutical habit. The exact cause of death might be pneumonia, tuberculosis, heart failure, liver disease, or any of the other conditions that disproportionately affected people living in marginal circumstances with compromised immune systems. The laudanum addiction would be a contributing factor, rather than the immediate cause, making it possible for official records to ignore the role of dependency in your eventual demise. You would be buried in a pauper's grave with minimal ceremony, your death noted only in parish records that would be filed away and forgotten within a few years. The people who had known you would remember you for a while, but their own struggles for survival would eventually crowd out memories of someone whose life had been defined primarily by pharmaceutical necessity rather than meaningful accomplishment or relationship. But your life, however constrained and damaged by addiction, had still been a human life with its own internal experiences, relationships, struggles, and small victories. The laudanum that dominated your existence could not entirely eliminate the person you had been or prevent moments of connection, insight, pleasure, or hope from breaking through the chemical haze. In those moments, brief and precious as they were, you remained recognizably human despite everything that had worked to reduce you to nothing more than a delivery system for opium. Those moments justified the struggle to continue, even when continuation seemed pointless and the future appeared hopeless. The bottle would win in the end, as it won with most of the people who fell under its influence in Georgian London. But the battle you fought against its demands, however ultimately unsuccessful, demonstrated qualities of determination and resilience that deserved acknowledgement, even if they couldn't achieve victory. Your story was one of thousands of similar stories, playing out simultaneously across London, each involving a unique individual whose potential had been constrained, but never entirely eliminated by the chemical circumstances of their existence. Together, these stories formed a hidden history of Georgian London that was rarely recorded in official documents, but was no less real for being largely invisible to contemporary observers. The laudanum epidemic of Georgian London would eventually end, not through any deliberate intervention or policy change, but through gradual shifts in medical knowledge, social attitudes, and legal frameworks that took decades to implement. Future generations would develop better understanding of addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing, and more effective treatments for both pain management and dependency. But that future would come too late for you, and for most of the people who shared your particular relationship with the brown bottle. You were casualties of a historical moment when effective pain relief was available, but knowledge about addiction was not, when chemical solutions to human problems were enthusiastically promoted without adequate understanding of their long-term consequences. Your legacy, if you had one, might be found in the small ways you had helped other people manage their own struggles with similar problems. The money shared when you had any to spare, the information about suppliers and prices passed along to fellow addicts, the companionship offered during particularly difficult periods of withdrawal or crisis. These acts of mutual aid represented the best aspects of human nature surviving under the worst possible circumstances, and perhaps in some small way, your story might serve as a reminder that addiction is fundamentally a human problem rather than simply a criminal or moral one, deserving of understanding and medical treatment rather than punishment and condemnation. The people trapped by laudanum in Georgian London were not fundamentally different from people struggling with similar problems in any other era. They were individuals trying to manage pain and find relief in a world that offered few resources for either, who found temporary salvation in a substance that ultimately proved to be another form of imprisonment. But they remained, until the very end, recognizably and irreducibly human beings whose lives had value beyond their pharmaceutical dependencies, whose stories deserved to be told and remembered even when those stories ended in defeat rather than triumph. In Georgian London's maze of narrow streets and crowded lodging houses, thousands of these stories played out with quiet desperation and occasional grace, forming a hidden history of human resilience in the face of circumstances that seemed designed to crush the spirit as thoroughly as they destroyed the body. The brown bottle might have claimed your life, but it could not claim your humanity entirely. That remained, however battered and constrained, until the very end.